I mentioned to you when we started learning this chapter that this is one of my most favorite chapters of Tanya, and today we're learning that little piece. There's a little piece that for me, it gives me such clarity in my life, and I think it's really what everybody struggles. You can't not struggle with this exact question that the author is going to describe to us. Everybody in the spiritual journey is struggling with this question. So let us get our bearings and then let's learn, because we have a little bit to learn today. We have a little bit to learn today, got to tell you. So first of all, we are beginning today on which page? Page 237, part 3 of the chapter, right? Part 3, page 237. And this is what the author ever told us until now. The author ever told us like this. On the one hand, beginning in chapter 29, the Alter Rebbe introduced us to a difficult concept. It was a tough pill to swallow. But the Alter Rebbe also wants us to be honest with ourselves. And the Alter Rebbe wants us to really understand ourselves. And the Alter Rebbe introduced us to the idea that living in a human body, living with an animal soul, and especially living with an animal soul at the very forefront of our consciousness, means that we live very spiritually deficient lives. Physical life is an embarrassment. Physical life is spiritually shameful. It's lowly. We are spiritually in the dumps. We are so distant from God. On a conscious level, we are so distant from God. And that is the idea that when you look at us from our body's perspective, from our animal soul's perspective, we're in deep trouble. We're in such deep trouble. That's the one thing the author told us. Now, the author explained to us why that was very important to know. Sometimes we need that healthy humility. Sometimes we also need to just simply have that self-awareness, healthy self-awareness. But then the Alter Rebbe told us, which is what we learned last week. But any of all those problems and any of that negativity, that all stems from the body and from the animal soul. But then we also have a godly soul. And the godly soul does not have any of those problems. The godly soul doesn't have any of those deficiencies. The godly soul is pure, is holy, is so precious. And it's such a force of goodness. The only problem is that our godly soul is trapped. Our animal soul hijacks all of our senses. We wake up in the morning, animal soul wants to eat. We eat, the animal soul wants to make money. We make money, the animal soul wants to go out to a fancy restaurant for dinner. I mean, yeah. It's nonstop animal soul. And the godly soul can barely get a word in. So the self of our problems asserts itself too much. The self where we are healthy and good and pure and godly, that voice is somewhat trapped. It's stifled. It's suffocated. So the Alter Rebbe says, when we become self-aware of the problems of our animal soul, that should only empower us and invigorate us to throw ourselves into action. Get into action mode. What's the action? The more spiritually in the dumps we are, the more we have to realize how desperate the situation is for our godly soul. The worse off we are spiritually, the more our godly soul is suffering. And therefore, the more immediate attention our godly soul needs. And the Alter Rebbe says, let's have compassion on our souls. Let's have a little bit of pity for ourselves. Dear friends, let's have a bit of pity for ourselves. Beyond all of our layers, at our core, we are godly, but our godly self needs expression. Our godly self is a little bit homesick. The godly soul knows of a life where it's connected to God. When we do a mitzvah, and whenever we study Torah, we are creating that connection. We are bringing ourselves into the environment of God. And that gives our soul unbelievable joy, which is why ultimately, and I think we spoke about this in the last class, but I think we could all relate to it. Whenever we do a meaningful mitzvah, even if it was hard to push ourselves to do the mitzvah. But once we do it, it always feels good. The animal soul is the opposite. It's very easy to do the choice. It's very easy to jump upon the impulse of the animal soul, but in the long run, it never feels that good, right? I actually read a study once, you can look it up online, that by the time you pay your bill at a restaurant, the pleasure of the food you've eaten is already gone. So, we all know there's a real pleasure of having really good food, a really good piece of steak, right? A half hour later, you're paying your bill, literally, psychologically, your brain is already totally past that pleasure. The pleasure is gone. That's how short-lived the pleasure is. The godly soul is the opposite. It sometimes takes a lot more effort to push ourselves, to act upon the impulse and the desire of our godly soul. To do a spiritual act, to do a holy act takes more effort. But once we do it, the dividends stay with us for so much longer. And we are experiencing the satisfaction and the joy and just the internal health. When we feel the health of our godly soul, it feels so good. Spiritual experiences are ultimately the best experiences to give to ourselves because they're so rewarding. They stay with us forever. We'll always be looking back and saying, wow, I had such a special experience. Right? Joel Lieb, you joined us a few months ago on the Shabbat, from the Shabbat on the Heights. And that was a spiritual experience, right? And that is an experience that you don't forget easily, right? But if you went to a restaurant a week ago, chances are you're never thinking about that experience again, right? I don't know, I ate a steak. I barely remember what it looked like, what it tasted like. In the moment, it felt good. Spiritual experiences stay with us. So the Alter Rebbe says, look at this. Instead of beating ourselves up about our problems, let's not worry about our problems. Let's focus on creating spiritual health. Spiritual health is when we do a mitzvah, because that is health for our godly soul, because our godly soul needs to be connected to God. If it's not connected to God, it's like a fish out of water. It's homesick. It's desperate. It can't be healthy. It can't sleep well at night. You're a mess on the inside. You're miserable. But you do a mitzvah, you study Torah, you connect back with Hashem. And that is health. That is joy for the soul. And the Alter Rebbe says, don't focus on your problems. Focus on creating spiritual health. And in the words of the Alter Rebbe, focus on returning your soul back to God. And that's very practical. You know how you return your soul back to God? Do another mitzvah. If you're feeling a little bit spiritually inept, you're feeling a little bit spiritually down, take out a book, take out a Torah book, and sit down and study for a half hour. You'll feel better. Your soul is back in touch with God. You are back in touch with the flow of health. So the Alter Rebbe says, at the end of the day, even though we learned a lot about our spiritual what's the proper grammar? We learned about our spiritual
inadequacy.
There we go. Thank you so much. We learned a lot about spiritual inadequacy. But the conclusion is not that we should be depressed and down about it. The conclusion is that should only inspire us to invest in helping our soul more. Our soul needs a lot of help. So at the end of the day, focus on your soul. And the Alter Rebbe says, when we focus on our soul, you will start feeling the joy of your soul. And the Alter Rebbe says, listen into that voice. Listen into the joy, to the celebration of your soul. Because there's a celebration happening. It's like the celebration of being released from captivity. The Alter Rebbe says, the greater the captivity, the greater the joy is when you're released. So the worse off we are spiritually, the greater the joy is when we do a mitzvah. So the Alter Rebbe says, listen into that joy. Tune in and celebrate it. Feel it. Celebrate with your soul. And the Alter Rebbe is telling us, that's it. Invest in our soul. We have to invest in the joy of our soul, and there's a lot of joy to be found there. When you invest in your animal soul, you're only going to get more and more depressed. Which is true, right? Never has that been proven more than our times, 21st century. There's never been a time in all of human history that so many humans have the capability of feeding our soul, our animal souls. Today we could feed our animal souls whatever it wants, whenever we want. Today, the lower middle class has the capabilities of what used to be the top highest class. So we're feeding our animal souls nonstop. And you know what the crazy thing is? Are we any happier because of it? No. If anything, we're more miserable. It's a crazy phenomenon. It just shows you, feeding the animal soul does not bring joy. It brings fleeting moments of gluttony. It's like a high, but not more than that. Okay. So the author says that's it. Invest in your soul, invest in your real joy. You have joy inside of you. There's a celebration waiting to happen, and that celebration is when you do a mitzvah. But now I can have a little question. And this is a question, I think we all have this question. We all suffer from this. It doesn't, by the way, this is a dilemma that it doesn't matter how religious or secular you are. Everybody suffers from this dilemma. The Alter is saying, invest in the joy of your godly soul. You've got problems? Whatever. Don't worry so much about those. You move on. You create joyful spiritual moments. People have a hard time with that. I think we all have a hard time with that. We sometimes feel maybe a little bit dishonest when we do that. Maybe we feel a little bit like a hypocrite when we do that. What happens? The Alter is giving you a beautiful proposition. Do a mitzvah, study Torah, invest and tap into the joy of your soul. Try to just get into that mode of the bliss of your soul. And you say, you know what? I don't feel right doing that. You know why? Because I know I'm going to go home, and in 2 hours from now, I'm going to do something that is totally not in line with that soul. I'm not going to do the most godly thing later on today. And you know, yesterday I didn't do the most godly thing. So you want me to right now do a spiritual experience for my soul, but tonight I'm not going to be eating kosher? You want me to be investing on putting on tefillin today, but I'm not going to be putting on tefillin tomorrow? You want me to do this now, but I'm not going to be keeping Shabbos tomorrow? And at a certain point we say, am I lying to myself that I'm giving myself these spiritual experiences, but I'm not really there yet? So we sometimes hold ourselves back because of our spiritual inadequacy. And we say, you know what? I'm not ready to jump. I don't feel right jumping. I feel like a hypocrite. And I've heard this as a Chabad rabbi, and I've heard this from my own Yetzer Hara. I've had people tell me, I don't feel right putting on tefillin. I'm not going to put on tefillin if I'm not committed to this. I'm not going to put it on today. It sounds like a noble argument, but at a certain point, it's a tension of life. You want me to be a good person today, but I know I'm not going to be a good person tomorrow, so why should I do it today? You want me to invest in my godly soul today and try to get into a spiritual experience? But it's not a long-term commitment, so I don't feel right doing it. So we have a conflict. The animal soul is pulling us down. The godly soul wants us to move up. And we have to kind of choose. Where do we go? Which soul do we remain true to? Do we tell our godly soul, yeah, let's go, let's have fun. Let's have celebrations. Let's have beautiful spiritual celebrations. Or do we say once, I can't go. It's not right. My animal soul is not ready for this. That's a question. Do we all identify with that question? What do you say? It's a question. We all. I think anybody in a spiritual journey, we wonder, you know, am I being dishonest with myself? I've got so many spiritual problems, so spiritually inadequate, and you want me to start having these beautiful spiritual celebrations and godly? It just doesn't feel right. I'm not there. So that is where we're up to. This is a critical question of Tanya. Part 3, which is called Identify with Your Soul, page 237. Let's read what the Alter Rebbe says. Says the Alter Rebbe, and yet, we speak about tapping into the joy of the soul when it's released from captivity and it's able to reconnect with God, says the Alter Rebbe, and yet the body self, the consciousness of the body, remains just as loathsome and repulsive as ever. Which means, yeah, we could have wonderful spiritual moments. We could put on tefillin today and we could study Torah, and it does feel good. But let's be honest, the body is not changing. The animal soul is not changing. Our animal self is still just as bad as it was before. So then we ask, how then can we blissfully plug into the joy of the soul's freedom? How does that make sense? How does that work? How is that honest? How is that real? The Zohar refers to the body as the serpent's skin. This is very, very interesting. The Zohar says that when the serpent caused Adam and Eve to do the original sin, he left his mark, he left a scar on humanity. And our bodies carry that negative energy from the serpent. We don't mean the physical body. We don't mean our physical skin. We mean on a spiritual level. The body identity is the serpent's skin. We are trapped under a layer of the serpent's skin. Why does the Zohar call us the serpent's skin? Because when you get down to its essential self, the animal soul never really changes for good. I'm missing an L there. The animal soul never really changes for good. We all know this. The animal soul is an animalistic, selfish creature from the day it was born, and it's not changing. It's gonna be that way when we die. It's one of the bitter pills the Alter Rebbe told us. The animal soul is always gonna remain a little bit of a troublemaker. So says the Alter Rebbe, it never becomes entirely absorbed within holiness. The animal soul never really becomes holy. So if this problem hasn't been solved, is it not at least a little bit disingenuous to devote yourself to the soul's joy? Is it not a little bit disingenuous, a little bit dishonest, a little bit like a fraud? Yeah, let me do a mitzvah and get a spiritual experience and connect to God. Nah, who are you fooling? The same low life that the animal soul was yesterday, it's still that today. Who are you fooling? All of a sudden you become a Mr. and Mrs. Holy Man. Nah, you've got an animal soul, you've got problems. You're gonna start acting and having celebrations and tapping into your soul as if everything's okay? That's not the way it works. That's the tension. So what's the answer? The Alter Rebbe gives us a few such short lines. But to me, I think about these lines at least once a week, probably more than once a week. This is really the guiding lines for me from Tanya. And I could say Tanya changed my life because of these few lines. And I'm very sincere about this. My whole life hangs upon these lines. You ready? Bottom page 237. Says the Alter Rebbe, nevertheless, you have a choice which soul to prioritize and hold more precious. You got to choose which soul is your priority, which soul is more precious to you. And tells us the Alter Rebbe, hold your divine soul more precious to you than the despicable body self. Choose the divine soul to be your priority, to be what's more precious to you. So celebrate it, and don't let the misery of the body self compromise and confuse the celebration of the soul. Let's chew this over. These such precious few lines of Tanya. The Alter Rebbe says, I know the conflict is real. The conflict is very real. And because the conflict is real, you're going to have to choose which side of the conflict is more important to you. Which means the Alter Rebbe is not necessarily, at least at this point in Tanya, solving the crisis for us, solving the conflict. The conflict is real. And because it's real, we have to make a choice. I'll tell you a little story. When I was, I think, 11 years old, an 11-year-old boy, one of my youngest aunts got married, and there was a brand new hall being built in Crown Heights, and it was sponsored by a relative of mine, and he named the hall after my great-grandfather, so my aunt's grandfather. And she was going to be the very first wedding in this beautiful brand new hall in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights. And it was a beautiful thing, right? That the granddaughter of the person whose name this hall carries. It's going to be the very first wedding, but the problem was it was down to the wire. The hall, they were rushing to get it ready in time for the wedding, and I remember that early afternoon they were finishing to paint the hallways of the hall. A few hours before the wedding, we come to the wedding, and the hallway, there's signs on there: wet paint. Make sure don't touch the walls. My older sister, she must have been what, 16, 17. She has a dress and it's a little bit fleary. And at one point, somebody notices, oh, her dress got a little bit of paint. And we run to the bathroom and we try washing it off. It's not coming off. And I saw something so amazing. My oldest sister, she found the inner courage to say, you know what? I'm pretty bummed that this happened, but it's a wedding. I got to celebrate. Whatever. And she found a way that in the pictures she could stand a certain way, and if she stands that way, the paint is not going to be there. Now, I know that if that happened to me, I would be in such a bad mood. Right? I have a beautiful new suit for the wedding, and the whole family's going to be there, and now I'm going to be so embarrassed. And I wouldn't be up to celebrating and dancing. But I want to use it as a metaphor for life. We could have two opposing emotions happening at once. We could have two opposing experiences happening at once. Our soul has a wedding to attend. Our soul has a life that it could live. Our soul has a celebration waiting to happen. And that celebration is a mitzvah. That celebration is a connection with Hashem. That celebration is learning Torah. But then there's the animal soul. And the animal soul is dealing with the paint and the mud. It's dirty, it's got problems, it wants to be depressed. And we just have to decide. Which experience here am I going to say is most important? So my sister made a pretty amazing and mature decision that even though if it was yesterday, I'd be very upset. And if it was tomorrow, I'd be very upset. But today I've got a wedding to attend. And in my mind, the wedding is more important than my disappointment about the paint. So you just got to choose. You got to choose. Who are you going to plug into? Who gets the priority of your consciousness? You can't be experiencing two emotions at once. You can't be dancing and celebrating at the same time being all bummed out at the world that your dress got full of paint. Which one is it? So the Alter Rebbe tells us something so empowering. Never allow the sadness, the misery, the depression of your animal soul to get in the way of the celebration that your divine soul can have today. Anytime that we deny ourselves a spiritual experience because we say, oh, Rabbi, I'm not ready. Oh, Rabbi, I'm a Reformed Jew. Oh, Rabbi, I don't put on tefillin, so I'm not going to put it on today. What you're basically doing is you're saying, okay, my animal soul gets the priority. So my animal soul gets the priority of my life, and my godly soul is only able to have experiences whenever my animal soul deems it comfortable. The Alter Rebbe says, no, do it the opposite way. Tell your animal soul that I've got a godly soul, and I'm going to give my godly soul the priority of my attention. And if my godly soul can have an amazing experience today, and you're saying, whoa, you're going to have an amazing experience, but don't you know we've got all these problems? Say, too bad. The problems I'll deal with tomorrow or next week. I don't know. I'll send the dress to the dry cleaners tomorrow. But today I've got a wedding to attend. Today I've got a soul, a godly soul, and I need to plug into that soul and live its life. And the Alter Rebbe gives us the empowerment, gives us the permission to have that courage. Jump on board with your godly soul and tell your animal soul, I'm sorry. I can't allow your problems to disturb the experience I want to have right now. And the Alter Rebbe says, don't make the mistake. of telling your godly soul, I'm sorry, my godly soul. I know we could do something amazing, but I've got an animal soul, and my animal soul says we're not ready for your experience. You know why? Because we want to be sad. You know why? Because we want to delve more into our spiritual inadequacy. Alter says, no. Bad idea in life. You can't wait until you're fully ready for all experiences. Sometimes you'll be ready. Sometimes you'll go to a wedding and your dress will be beautiful. And then it's all good. Coast is clear. You could dance at the wedding. But sometimes there'll be a conflict. And when there's a conflict, hold your soul more precious. Hold your soul more precious. Tap into the soul. Never deny your soul an experience because your animal soul has got its problems. Never do that. That's like going to the wedding and saying, I'm not dancing tonight. You know why? I've got paint on my dress. But it's your aunt's wedding. Well, what can I do? I'm in a bad mood. I can't do it. The author says, have a healthy perspective, healthy priorities. Let's read that paragraph again. I want to read that paragraph again with you. Bottom page 237. Nevertheless, says the Alter Rebbe, you have a choice which soul to prioritize and hold more precious. Which soul are you going to consider more of a priority? Hold your divine soul more precious to you than the despicable body self. So celebrate it and don't let the misery of the body self compromise and confuse the celebration of the soul. Don't let it confuse that celebration. It's such an empowering permission. The author is giving us permission. Go and do it. Stop beating yourself up. Oh, but I'm being hypocritical. I'm not being real to myself. Who am I fooling? No, you're not fooling nobody. You're living true to yourself. And yes, you've got problems, but that's a different soul. You're choosing to prioritize the experience of this soul. God bless you. That's how it works. So number one, before we go on, dear friends, I just want to share with you, this attitude takes practice. Never think twice when there's a good spiritual experience to be had. Don't say, am I ready? Maybe next year, maybe in 6 months, I don't know. Never do that. The moment you do that, you are allowing your animal soul to hijack your life. The opposite. Have the godly soul hijack your life. Tell the animal soul, guess what? I don't care about your problems. I'm doing this experience. It's so rewarding. It's so liberating. The author says we have to do this. This is how we live life. And the author is going to teach us that this mode of living life is essential to the Jewish experience. Let's continue reading. The author is going to call this attitude of plug into your soul. Stop worrying about your problems. Don't let your animal soul disturb the joy that you could be having now with your godly soul. The Alter Rebbe calls that living in Exodus mode. In Exodus. Like the Jews left Egypt, they had an Exodus. When we do that, that's our Exodus. And the Alter Rebbe is going to give us such a beautiful piece of Tanya over here. Let's read page 238. Exodus mode. Says the Alter Rebbe, this mode is being in Exodus mode. Why is this called Exodus mode? Let's read. In the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the Jews are described as fleeing. Quote, the people fled. All right, that's how the story goes. The people didn't walk out of Egypt with their heads held high. As free men, the Jews escaped. Says the Alter Rebbe, but when you think about it, it seems bizarre. Why did they have to flee? If they had asked Pharaoh to set them free forever, wouldn't he have been forced to let them go after experiencing the 10 plagues? What's going on over here? So let me give you a little bit of the background over here. If you look properly and carefully at the narrative of the Exodus as it is in the Torah, Pharaoh never willfully let the Jews leave Egypt. What happens is, right, the basic outline of the story is Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh, says, let my people go free. It's like that they could go to Mount Sinai and serve God. Pharaoh says no. Moses starts bringing upon The Egyptians, one plague after another, first blood and frogs and lice. And each plague breaks the morale of Egypt and of Pharaoh more and more. And after 10 plagues, Pharaoh says, enough! I've had enough of this. Tell me what you want and I'll do it. This was Moses' golden moment. He broke Pharaoh. Pharaoh was coming, crying, pleading. He's on his knees, saying, tell me whatever you want, I'll give it to you. You know what Moses answered? Moses says, please let us go to the desert for 3 days. That's what he says. 3 days, he says. Pharaoh says, 3 days? Granted, get out of here. 3 days later, Pharaoh says, no, the Jews are back. And they're like, no, they're not back. So Pharaoh says, okay, why don't you go out and figure out what's going on with them? So he sends out scouts, and the scouts come back, and the scouts say, Pharaoh, we've got news for you. The Jews, they didn't go 3 days away. They're going. They're not turning back. They're escaping. They're fleeing. And Pharaoh says, what? That's such a chutzpah. Moses told me only 3 days, and that's it. Pharaoh right away mobilizes the Egyptian army, all the chariots, and they go on a chase after the Jews, and they meet up at the Dead Sea, and then there's a splitting of the sea. That's the story. The Alter is asking a very simple question here. What's going on over here? Pharaoh is at his breaking point. Pharaoh will say yes to anything. Tell Pharaoh to jump off a roof, he'll do it for you. He's desperate. Moses has got all the chips in his hand. Moses has the upper hand in the negotiations. Moses can say whatever he wants. And Moses says 3 days. Is that the worst negotiation in all of human history? Why is he starting so low? Moses should have said, let us go, out of here, we're out, free men. Moses doesn't do that. Moses says 3 days. And then there's a whole drama that Pharaoh says, oh, you cheated, you're escaping, you're fleeing. So the Alter Rebbe says, what's going on over here? Pharaoh was ready to let the Jews go. Why did Moses make this whole setup that the Jews had to flee and escape? Doesn't make any sense. It's a good question, no? This question opens up a whole new understanding of the Exodus story, the story of the Exodus of Egypt. The Alter is going to tell us, yes, Pharaoh was ready to let the Jews go. But on a spiritual level, the Jews weren't ready to go. On a spiritual level, the whole Exodus had to be an escape. It couldn't be about freedom, comfortably walking out in freedom. It had to be about an escape. And the physical story, the phenomena of the Exodus of Egypt, the way it played out in this physical world, had to reflect the spiritual truth of what this Exodus story was really all about. Let's read. Says the Alter Rebbe, but the problem was not Pharaoh. Pharaoh was ready to let the Jews go, but that was not the problem. The problem was on a spiritual plane. It was a spiritual problem. That the negativity within the Jewish soul was still dominant in the left ventricle of their hearts. For it was not until the giving of the Torah that their impurity departed them. Essentially, they weren't internally ready to leave Egypt behind. Okay, this is a very deep concept. We gotta unpack this. You know, to make a spin off the famous saying, the Jews, God could have taken the Jews out of Egypt. But to take the Egypt out of the Jews, that's a whole different story. Our sages describe, and we even speak about it on the Seder night, the Jews were at their lowest spiritual point before the Exodus from Egypt. The Jews have lost so much of their spirituality, of their holiness. And the Jews, the impurity of Egypt really rubbed off on the Jews. They were spiritually naked, which is what we say in the Haggadah, Va'at Eram Ve'erya. The Jewish soul was naked. The Jewish soul was not beautiful. It was an embarrassment. The Jews could have left geographic Egypt, but the Jews would have still carried Egypt with them in their heart. Which means maybe you could free them practically, but on a psychological level, on a spiritual level, they were still imprisoned to Egypt. Today we have the term, what's it called? It's called something syndrome. Stockholm syndrome, that's it, right? That's Stockholm syndrome. You practically take the person out of exile, but guess what? Their soul is still in exile. Mentally, they're still in exile. That was the problem with the Jews. And the Jews knew it. Let's even think about the psychology of the Jews on a psychological level. Can you imagine Moses tells the Jews, I've got amazing news for you. Next week, we're going to have Seder night. We're making the very first Seder in history. Make a Seder, get matzah, your lamb, get it all ready, gather in your homes. It's going to be the final plague. Next morning, we're out of Egypt. Can you imagine you're a Jew? You hear Moses saying this, and Moses says, listen, we're going out of Egypt. God wants to meet us on Mount Sinai. It's going to be amazing. God wants to hug us and kiss us and enter into a relationship with us. And you're like, whoa, Moses. I'm not ready for this. I'm a little bit ashamed to show up to God. I look like this. I'm such a mess. Can you give me a few more weeks? Can you give me a few more months? Let me clean myself up a little bit. I'll do some rehabilitation. I'll try to spiritually grow. I'm not ready. I'm not ready to meet God. I'm not ready for this amazing spiritual experience. Let me first clean up shop. Let me first clean myself out. It took a lot of courage for the Jews to say, you know what? Let me get out of here. And I know that I'm not going to be perfect. I know I'm not ready to get out, but I'm going to get out anyways. That's what it means to escape. On a psychological level, to escape means you're not ready for it. Nothing is ready. The environment is not ready. You don't have permission to escape, but you escape anyways. And that was really what the exodus of Egypt was all about. It was the Jews saying, you know what? I know that I'm so in the dumps. I know that I'm so spiritually naked, but you know what? I'm just going to make a dash for it. And the Alter says that took a lot of courage. On a spiritual, psychological level, the Jews were escaping their own problems. And therefore, the way the Exodus story was manifest in real life, it also had to be an escape. Let's read it in the words of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe says, yet despite this, despite the fact that the Jews were so impure and had Egypt, the stranglehold of Egypt inside of them, yet despite this, their focus and desire was to escape. They wanted to just spiritually escape. What does that mean? To release their divine souls out of the exile of the Sitra Achra, meaning the impurity of Egypt, and to bond with God. The Jews said, you know what? I know I'm not ready to bond with God. I know I'm bringing so much bad baggage with me to my relationship with God, but I'm going to do it anyways. And the Jews internally made that courageous move. Let me just get out of here. Let me stop overthinking this. I'm not ready for it, but I'm going anyways. And the Alter Rebbe says, and that is why the Exodus needed to be as an escape, reflecting the spiritual reality. And the Alter Rebbe says, we need to follow the same model. Celebrate, not freedom, we celebrate the Exodus. We celebrate the escape. We live our own Exodus every single day when we do the same courageous move that those Jews did back then in Egypt. Stop holding yourself back because of your problems. Instead, say, I've got a soul, and my soul has a mission. My soul has an identity. Let me escape my own problems and run with my soul. My problems, I'll deal with that later. 7 weeks from now, when the Jews got the Torah, then they got rid of the problems. At Mount Sinai, they were fully cleansed from their impurity. But today, we got to dash. Today, we got to move. We can't hold back the possibility of today because of my problems. The Alter says, when we do that, that's Exodus. That's your own Exodus. That's your own splitting of the sea. That is amazing. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to remember the Exodus of Egypt every single day of your life. Can you imagine that? There's a mitzvah. It's one of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. Don't let a day of your life go by without remembering the Exodus. You can think that's a little bit extreme. Exodus is the top thing I need to be thinking about every single day? Why? And the Alter says, you know why? Because the story of your life. We all need to live in Exodus mode. A successful Jewish spiritual life is about being in Exodus mode. This is your life every single day. We got to learn from that generation of Jews how to be courageous. Don't tell your problems, you know what? Yeah, I know, I've got problems. I'm not moving. I got to first deal with my problems. The opposite. Tell your problems, we've got problems, and guess what? I'm moving ahead anyways. I'll deal with you later. I don't even know it. You don't even have to have a plan. I'll deal with it later. When do we celebrate the Seder? We celebrate the Seder on the very night that the Jews left Egypt. We don't celebrate the Seder 7 weeks later when the Jews were fully rehabilitated, when the Jews were back again at spiritual health. We celebrate the escape. The escape is what we celebrate. We don't celebrate perfection. Perfection was when the Jews were at Mount Sinai 7 weeks later. That's a different holiday. But celebrating the Exodus is celebrating the escape amidst the mess. Don't let your problems hold you back. That is what's worthy of a celebration. That's what's worthy of a Seder. That's what's worthy of freedom. True freedom is us telling ourselves, giving us permission to move forward with our souls despite any problems. As the Alter continues, and we follow that model of fleeing. We do that. As the verses say, God is my strength and my fortress, my escape on a troubled day. You've got trouble? Go to God, run and escape. And the next verse, God is my high place and my escape, and he is my escape. Here we see, it's a model of Jewish life. Escape to God, escape with your godly soul. Don't look back. Don't let your problems hold you back. The Alter says, and don't worry about it. Dealing with our problems and moving past our problems with a sense of redemption, that's only going to happen when Mashiach comes. But until then, we're in Exodus mode. Says the Alter Rebbe, and that explains why it is said about the future redemption, page 239, that when God will remove the spirit of impurity from the earth, God is going to do it then. Then God's going to remove all of our spiritual problems. Then the verse says that you will not have to flee because God will go before you. Then it says we won't have to flee anymore. When Mashiach comes, we'll be able to say, oh, we've earned our redemption. We are past our problems. And now we could approach God at a full spiritual health. That's good, but that's going to be when Mashiach comes. But until then, the model we should follow is the one of fleeing and escaping. There we have it. This is the message of the Alter Rebbe. Never let your problems hold you back. Live a successful, joyful celebration. Attend the wedding today, just like the Jews did when they left Egypt. They said, we've got potential. We've got a gift. God wants to meet us at Sinai. I can't let my problems hold me back. Let's go. And the Alter Rebbe says, let's all give ourselves permission to be that courageous and move forward. Stop holding yourself back. Stop getting in your own way. Stop overthinking it. We'll deal with our problems in 7 weeks from now. Don't first do housekeeping and then grow. First grow. Don't worry about the housekeeping. That's what the Alter was telling us. Dear friends, we have 10 minutes left, and I want to do the last page of the chapter. The last part of the chapter is a brand new meditation. And it's a meditation that the Alter Rebbe says, in addition to everything we've learned above, here's another layer. Another layer that's going to give us even more joy in our life. And again, we have the tension. We have the animal soul with the animal soul's problems, and we have the potential of the godly soul. So step one, which the Alter Rebbe told us, is don't let your animal soul hold you back. Tell yourself that my godly soul is more important and run with it. But here's another layer. And this layer gives us even more confidence and even more joy of living the struggle of life, living the struggle of having a godly soul and living within the environment of such a terrible animal soul. Says the Alter Rebbe like this. Part 4, the joy of living your purpose. And we're going to go through this piece a little bit quicker. Says the Alter Rebbe, there is a way to charge this soul return with even more power and intensity from deep inside your heart, as well as to add brightness and joy to your celebration of the soul. So this is a way that you could get even more power, more excitement, and even more motivation with this mission of soul return, bringing your soul back to God, and to make it even more joyful. Says the Alter Rebbe, it's a matter of taking to heart a certain awareness and understanding that consoles your misery and sorrow. Here we have it. We have to give ourselves a certain perspective, and it will console us. Continues the Alter Rebbe, you say to yourself, continuing from where you left off above. So here we have another script, right? The Alter Rebbe is telling us, okay, we got to talk to ourselves. So this is what we should tell ourselves. It's all true, without any doubt. I am so utterly distant from God, which is what we started speaking about in the script from last class. Oh, but here the script continues. But look, I didn't make myself. Such an empowering line. Yeah, I've got an animal soul. My animal soul is so spiritually in the dumps. But guess what? Did I make myself? Did I design myself? No. Who made me with my animal soul? Who made my animal soul be so spiritually inadequate? It was God. It's God's fault, not my fault. So then the script continues. So why did God do such a thing? To take a bit of his light that pervades and transcends all worlds, before which everything might as well not exist. This tremendous godly light. And why did he cast that light down? Investing it in a serpent's skin and in a putrid seminal drop. Why would God do that? To take his powerful light, a piece of God, put it into my body, put it to live with my animal soul, put it into this environment of the physical world. Why would God do that? Continues the script, continues the Alter Rebbe, it could only be that this investment is the necessary downswing that leads to the upswing. It must be that God did this, which is not a comfortable thing to do for the soul, in order that there should be a certain gain, a certain profit, a certain upswing. We end up with a net gain. What's the net gain? The net gain is like this. The life-giving animal soul that is from Klipat Noga, and all of its garments, its thought, speech, and action, need to be lifted up to God. Oh, this is the purpose. We need to take the force of life, which is ungodly, and connect it with God. We need to take our animal soul, which is Klipat Noga, and all the energies of the animal soul, and we need to bring it up to God. How do we do that? Says the Alter Rebbe, and that happens when the animal soul with all of its energies, are invested in the thought, speech, and action of Torah. There you go. There you have it. Why did God put me, a godly soul, to live with an animal soul? It's very simple, because that's the purpose of creation. That we should take the force of klipa, the force of ungodliness, and we should connect it with a mitzvah, connect it with God. That's why. That's why we're living this tension. That's why we're living the struggle. We are designed to fulfill the divine purpose. So God created a human being with a force of nature, which is totally ungodly, and with a force of God. On the one hand, they're like two opposite magnets. You can't get them to click, right? You know, like those magnets which are not compatible, right? It's impossible. So there's so much tension within us. That's the goal. These two totally opposite forces, that the godly soul should inspire the animal soul and connect the animal soul with a mitzvah. Every single time we do a mitzvah, we're taking resources from our animal soul and investing it into a mitzvah. That's the purpose. Now, the Alter Rebbe tells us right now in parentheses that later, starting in chapter 36, we will explain this upgrading process at length. Uh-oh, I'm missing a page over here. Am I missing a page over here? 8, 9. Okay, 1 second. My page is probably right over here. Let's get it. Oh, here we go. All right, phew. So, later we will explain this upgrading process at length. There we will describe how this is the ultimate purpose behind the world's creation. So don't worry, this whole concept that us elevating nature and connecting it with godliness, that's a big topic. It's about to come up in Tanya, a few more chapters. So we'll get there soon. But this is the purpose of all of creation. The point is that living your life, not living a beautiful, holy life, but living the life of tension, that's your purpose. So the script continues, page 240. So if that's the case, then this is what I will do, and this will be my entire goal all the days of my life. Says the Alter Rebbe, don't resent your life. Don't resent the fact you've got an animal soul with problems. Embrace it, because that's your purpose. And when you realize it's your purpose, you'll commit yourself to it. You'll do this. It'll be your entire goal of all days of my life. To what? I am going to throw all the energy of my spirit and soul into these mitzvahs. As the verse goes, to you, O God, I lift my soul. There you go. To you, God, I lift my soul. Which is referring to the animal soul. I'm going to take my animal soul and lift it up to God. How do we do this? Practically speaking, that means to bind my thoughts and speech with God's thoughts and speech. What's God's thoughts and speech? Which are the well-defined set of Torah instructions for life that are accessible to all. Learn Torah, learn God's instructions, and that your thoughts now become God's thoughts. God's thoughts become your thoughts. You're taking your animal soul's ability to even think and binding it with God. Study Torah. And the same goes for my actions. I will bind them to his actions through observing the mitzvahs. You take your animal soul's ability to function, biological functionality, do a mitzvah with it, all of a sudden God's actions become your actions. And the Alter Rebbe concludes with the message of the chapter. Now we can understand, with the whole messaging of the chapter, the Alter Rebbe says, now we can understand why the Torah is said to return the soul. King David describes the Torah as returning the soul. Because that's what Torah is all about. It returns the soul. Because it brings the soul back to its original roots. Every mitzvah we do binds us closer to God. It binds our godly soul closer to God, and it binds our animal soul closer to God. It's about this returning power that it was said, God's rules are straight, they bring joy to the heart. And when we do another mitzvah, because we are bringing ourselves closer to God, that's joy. And the Alter Rebbe says, we need to realize that. The true joy of life is when we do a mitzvah. You'll feel it. You don't have to understand it. It's the joy of your soul bonding with God, and it's the joy of you fulfilling your purpose. And the Alter Rebbe says, if we can only make that shift to, on a conscious level, identify more with our divine soul, allow our divine soul to shine more within us, to hold it more precious, we will be able to feel more and more the joy of the soul. And that's chapter 31. Next chapter, next week, chapter 32, tells us that when we do this, identify more with our divine soul, we also get to unleash the love of our soul. So this chapter is about the joy of the soul. Next week is about the love of the soul. Loving our fellow Jew. And how we could really tap into that when we do this attitude. So beautiful, beautiful chapters going on over here, dear friends. I'm going to wish you all a wonderful evening. L'chaim, l'chaim. For wonderful learning of Tanya. And we'll see you all very soon. God bless you all. Have a wonderful week and a wonderful day, wonderful week, wonderful summer. We'll see you all very soon.